Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 3 horror stories. I publish stories every day, so if you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The Silent Village. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old car as it slowly crawled down the desolate, overgrown road. The town's name was the last sign that anyone had left to read, faded and barely legible, hanging crookedly on a rusted pole, the Silent Village. Adam had never heard of it before, and even though the map showed it as a legitimate stop on his road trip, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crawled up his spine. It was dusk when he entered. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, twisted shadows over the ruins of what might have once been a charming village. There were no lights, no sounds, nothing, just the eerie silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. His headlights illuminated the scene in brief flashes. A dilapidated church with its doors hanging ajar, a broken-down inn with its windows shattered, and homes that were crumbling into the earth like forgotten memories. Curiosity, that ever-persistent demon, tugged at him. He stopped the car and pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, just a blank screen. The village, it seemed, existed outside of modern time, and Adam was its newest visitor. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the air thick with a strange, metallic scent. As he walked toward the center of the village, his heart quickened. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, a heavy weight pressing on his chest with every step he took. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. A scream pierced the air. It came from the direction of the church. Adam froze. The scream echoed, raw and desperate, cutting through the stillness. His pulse raced as he hesitated. Should he go toward it, or should he leave? But curiosity had already sunk its claws into him. He took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move, and made his way toward the church. His footsteps were louder now, seeming to resonate against the silence. But the scream, it didn't stop. It came again, a guttural, pleading wail that seemed to scrape at his soul. The church was even worse up close. An ancient structure, its stone walls cracked and chipped, covered in moss, as though it had not seen human life in decades. Adam pushed open the door with a creak that seemed to make the entire building groan in response. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the once beautiful stained glass windows now shattered and covered in grime. And then he saw her, a woman, standing motionless at the altar, her back to him. She was tall, too tall for a human, and her long hair cascaded down her back like a dark veil. Her skin was ashen, almost gray, and she wore an old, torn dress that seemed out of place even for the village's forgotten time. "Are you okay?" Adam called out, his voice a mix of hesitation and dread. The woman turned. Her face was obscured by a dark shadow, but Adam could feel her eyes on him. Cold, empty, like two voids that saw right through him. She opened her mouth, but instead of a voice, there was only a sound like static, a low hum that vibrated through the air. His mind felt like it was being pulled apart by the noise, as though the very fabric of his thoughts was being unraveled. Before he could react, the ground trembled. A low growl resonated from beneath his feet, deep and guttural. The woman's face contorted, and her mouth stretched wider, far wider than humanly possible, her jaw unhinging in an impossible arc, exposing rows of jagged, black teeth. Adam stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind scrambling to comprehend what he was seeing. The woman lunged forward with unnatural speed, her hand shooting out to grab him, her fingers long and gnarled, like claws. He scrambled away, but the creature's grip was too strong. Her other hand shot out to cover his mouth, forcing him to remain silent. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He could barely breathe. The pressure built, his thoughts warping, twisting, as if something inside his skull was about to explode. The silence returned. Just like that. The church was still. The woman was gone. Adam stood there, gasping for air, his heart racing. The silence was unbearable now, thick and suffocating. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and painful. Suddenly, the door to the church slammed shut behind him. He whipped around, but there was no one there. The village, the whole world, seemed to be holding its breath. With trembling hands, Adam pulled out his phone again, desperate for some connection to reality. But the screen remained blank. He couldn't leave. The village had locked him in. And then he heard its footsteps, soft dragging like something or someone was slowly moving toward him from the darkness. The Silent Village, Part 2. Adam's heart raced as he strained to hear the soft, dragging footsteps coming closer, each step an agonizing eternity. His fingers trembled as he clutched the phone, the cold screen mocking him with its silence. It was as if the world outside this village had ceased to exist entirely. The oppressive quiet weighed on him, and the only sound he could hear now was the eerie scraping of feet across the floor. He forced himself to turn, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to run. There, at the far end of the church, in the deep shadows where the stained glass windows once let in light, a figure emerged. A man, or what could have once been a man. His skin was ashen and stretched tight over his skull, his eyes hollow pits of darkness, and his lips twisted into a grotesque, rictus grin. The figure's feet scraped against the cold stone as it shuffled forward, dragging something heavy behind it. A chain, perhaps, or a broken body. Its head tilted at an odd angle, as though its neck could no longer support the weight of its own twisted mind. Adam's breath hitched. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The figure was getting closer. Its head snapped up, the grin widening, if that was even possible. It spoke then, but its voice was not a voice. It was a low, buzzing hum that reverberated in the bones like the static from a broken radio. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the words vibrating in Adam's skull. "You shouldn't have come to the Silent Village." Before Adam could react, the figure lunged, faster than any human should be able to move. He stumbled backward, just managing to avoid the ghastly grip that reached for his throat. The thing didn't speak again. Instead, it just groaned, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, and began to drag itself toward him with that dreadful, scraping sound. He bolted. Adrenaline surged, burning through his veins as he dashed for the door. His feet barely touched the ground as he ran, the only thing in his mind, escape. The door was closer now. He reached for the handle, yanking it with all his strength. It was locked. Of course it is. Panic clawed at him, his mind fogging with fear. The dragging sound behind him was louder now. The thing was close, too close. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for some way out, some escape from the relentless pull of this nightmare. His gaze locked on the altar at the far end of the room, and an impulse, one he didn't fully understand, pushed him toward it. The floor beneath him seemed to groan, as if the building itself was alive and aware of his movement. He reached the altar and stared at the stone slab, its surface worn and covered in dust, the edges faintly glowing in the dim light. The buzzing hum grew louder, vibrating his very teeth, as if the air itself was thickening, becoming heavy with some unseen force. Something was wrong. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to be closing in on him. What is this place? The altar suddenly began to tremble. A low rumble passed through the floor, the vibrations pulsing through his feet. The stone slab lifted ever so slightly, as though it were a door, and beneath it, a shadowy opening appeared like a gaping maw. The air smelled of rot, of decay, of something far worse than death. Without thinking, Adam dove toward it. The thing was nearly upon him, its groaning now deafening, the smell of it, of death, of decay, intoxicating. He didn't dare look back as he dropped into the shadowy pit beneath the altar, the cold air rushing up to greet him. As he slid down the slick, narrow tunnel, he heard the scraping sound cease. The figure, it seemed, had stopped moving. The silence fell again, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Adam reached the bottom of the tunnel and found himself in a small, damp chamber. The walls were covered in mold and grime, but something in the center of the room caught his attention. Faint traces of light. He moved toward it cautiously, his body still trembling with fear, and saw that the light was coming from a strange, old lantern sitting on a pedestal. It flickered, its flame casting erratic shadows that danced and writhed on the walls like living things. As he reached for it, a cold, deep voice echoed through the chamber. The voice was ancient, trembling with a power older than time itself. You should not have entered the silent village. Adam froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice was not from the lantern. It was all around him, inside him. He turned to look, his eyes wide with terror. The chamber, no, the entire tunnel was filled with figures now, hundreds of them. Their eyes were all empty, hollow, like black voids, their bodies gaunt and twisted, their faces covered in layers of grime and dust. They were staring at him, watching him, waiting. "We have been waiting," one of them whispered. Its voice was a low rasp, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. The figures began to move then, slowly, silently, surrounding him. Their feet dragged on the floor, as if they were not quite touching it, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were no longer human, not in any real sense. They were something worse, something older, something beyond understanding. Adam backed away, his breath shallow. He felt like the walls were closing in around him again, but this time he could feel the weight of their gaze. Every inch of the chamber seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy that pressed against his mind. "Leave! Leave this place," another figure whispered, its voice so cold it felt like the temperature had dropped 100 degrees. "Before it's too late." Suddenly, the ground beneath Adam's feet cracked open. A deep, resonating roar echoed from the depths, shaking the entire chamber. The walls split, revealing a vast, endless void beneath them, swirling with dark clouds, with shapes, shadowy figures, floating just beyond his reach. "You cannot escape," a chorus of voices murmured. "Not once you've entered the silent village." The floor beneath Adam's feet crumbled, and he fell, spiraling into the abyss. The Silent Village, Part 3. The fall seemed endless. Time itself had twisted into a nightmare, stretching and warping with each agonizing second. Adam's body felt weightless, and yet, as he plummeted deeper, a sense of dread and vertigo gripped him tighter than any earthly force. He tried to scream, but his mouth was dry, his breath caught in his chest as the air grew thicker, colder. The darkness around him was absolute. There was no light, no sound, just a crushing, suffocating silence that seemed to consume everything, his thoughts, his very existence. For what felt like an eternity, he fell. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. He slammed into the ground with a sickening thud. His bones cracked, his ribs compressed, and the pain shot through his body like wildfire. He gasped for air, struggling to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, as if the gravity here was different, stronger, pulling him into the earth itself. He looked around. A cavern. A massive, sprawling cavern, so vast that its edges were lost in shadow. The air was damp, musty, thick with the scent of decay. But the worst part, by far, was the sound. Not the silence he'd grown accustomed to in the village, but a low, constant, rhythmic sound. A pulsing, like the heartbeat of something ancient and monstrous. The walls of the cavern were lined with hundreds, thousands of bones, old, yellowed, and brittle. Some were stacked neatly, while others lay in twisted, haphazard piles, as though they had been abandoned long ago by whoever, or whatever, had lived here. The bone-chilling hum vibrated through the air, and Adam realized it wasn't just the sound of a heartbeat. It was the sound of the entire cavern breathing, as if the very earth beneath him were alive. In the center of the cavern stood a massive altar, dark and ancient. It looked like it had been carved from the stone itself, its surface covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. At the altar's base, a dark pool of water lay still, reflecting nothing but the oppressive darkness. A cold, raspy voice broke the silence. "Welcome." Adam spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure stood at the edge of the pool, cloaked in shadow, its form barely visible against the inky blackness. The voice came again, a low hiss that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "You should not have entered, but now that you have, you are one of us." The figure stepped forward slowly, deliberately. As it did, the shadows seemed to bend and warp around it, creating an eerie aura of flickering light. Adam could now see the figure more clearly. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were obscured. Its face covered by a hood, its body cloaked in tattered robes that seemed to float around it like wisps of smoke. Adam's pulse quickened. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but his throat was tight. Words wouldn't come. The figure raised a hand, its long, gnarled fingers stretching toward him. "You are too late," it whispered. "You are already here, in the place that lies beyond time, beyond death. The Silent Village is a place of transformation, a place of ascension." The word ascension hung in the air like a death sentence. Adam took a hesitant step back, but the figure's voice grew louder, more insistent. "We were once like you," it continued, its voice now a cold, echoing chant. "But we chose to embrace the truth of the Silent Village, the truth of the dark forces that bind this world together. Now we are free, free from the shackles of life, free from the fear of death." The figure's hand gestured toward the altar, where the dark pool of water shimmered, its surface undisturbed, yet somehow alive with an unnatural glow. "Drink," the figure hissed. "Drink from the pool, and you will understand. You will see the truth. You will become like us, free from time, free from pain, free from the burden of existence." Adam's eyes locked onto the pool. The water seemed to ripple, as though it were alive, beckoning him closer. The temptation was unbearable. The desire to understand, to escape this nightmare that had trapped him, surged within him. But deep down, some instinct, some primal fear, screamed at him to run, to refuse. But the figure's voice was overpowering. "You cannot escape. There is no escape from the silent village. Once you enter, you belong to it. You belong to us." With shaking hands, Adam took a step toward the altar. He felt a strange pull, as if something beyond his control was drawing him in. The water glowed brighter as he approached, its surface now rippling violently. The low hum, the heartbeat of the cavern, grew louder, faster. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the water. "No!" a voice cried out from behind him. Adam spun around, and there, standing in the shadows, was another figure. This one was different, smaller, more fragile. A woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She wore an old, faded dress, and her hands were trembling as she stepped forward. "Don't drink it," she cried. "It's a trap. It's not what they say. It will consume you. You'll never escape. Not like I did." Her voice was desperate, her eyes wild with panic. Adam froze, the water just inches from his hand. The figure at the altar hissed, its voice turning cold, almost venomous. "She lies. She is one of us. She chose to become what we are. And so will you." The woman's gaze flickered to the figure, and she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I didn't choose it. I thought it was the only way to survive. But now I'm trapped here just like them, just like all of them." Her voice cracked as she stepped closer to Adam, her eyes filled with a deep, hopeless sorrow. "Don't drink. You'll become like them. You'll become one of the endless." For a moment, Adam hesitated. The pool seemed to call to him, but the woman's words, her desperation, planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Would he give in? Would he embrace whatever twisted fate awaited him? Or would he try to find a way out? Suddenly, the ground shook again. The cavern roared to life, the walls rattling as if the very earth was alive, angry. The shadows around the altar flickered and twisted, and Adam realized the truth. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. The village had claimed him, and soon it would claim her too. The last thing Adam saw before the darkness took him was the woman's tear-streaked face, her mouth moving in a silent scream.